Okay, good morning, everyone. As Ben helpfully introduced me, I am the Assistant Director for Social Care at the Council for Disabled Children. And as well as all of our kind of major kind of areas of practice improvement around SEND and social care, we also do a lot of work around the short breaks programme. And so we're really excited to be involved today in thinking about how we join up some of those local services for disabled children, young people and their families, and think about how some of the kind of purpose of the HAF programme itself and all of those other different pieces of kind of supports and services and provision for young people align, particularly in their outcomes. So I think I'm not going to go through all these in detail, because I'm sure that many of you are aware of kind of the different outcomes of the programme. You'll have been working on it for some time now, but actually so many of these are really clearly outcomes for all children and young people. But I guess the difference for children and young people with SEND is that our approach to engaging them and supporting them to participate in things in these ways might need to be more creative or differentiated in order to ensure that they have a kind of equity of experience with other children and young people who might be engaging. So what we're going to do throughout this session this morning is really explore in more detail what these outcomes mean for those children, how a wide range of services and supports can work together to really make sure that children and young people with SEND and their families can get as much out of the holiday activities and food programme as the rest of our populations that we're working with. So we're going to start by doing that. Chris, if you can move on to the next slide for me, by having a look at some of the evidence from the previous HAF kind of activity programme, as well as some of CDC's network around what the kind of findings are from them in their experience of the programme. So there are a few key points here that I just wanted to highlight. So in relation to the first one here, which talks about kind of some particular challenges around engaging with children and young people with SEND and their families, and some highlighted issues around there being insufficient time to engage with some of the planning processes. Also additional concerns around, for example, particular circumstances with some young people needing shorter sessions, some service providers that work with children with SEND already providing longer sessions than the 4 hours, kind of 4 days, 4 weeks approach. So actually, I think one of the important things with some of the providers that we've been speaking to and working with is about being as flexible as possible and identifying some of those key steps along the way. So there are already a huge number of providers in your local areas who will be engaging with children and young people with SEND and their families. There are routes into those through special schools, through disabled children's teams, through short breaks teams. So really thinking about actually where these relationships already exist and how we can make sure that families have the information they need. And a bit later on in the session, we'll come on to talking about the information, advice and support services and the local offer for SEND and how we can use those things to get these messages out to families. The second one around recruitment, particularly being difficult where staff to young person ratios were high. And I think this has also been a real challenge as a result of some of the restrictions due to COVID, particularly for this group of children, where we're going to have some young people who are going to be kind of categorised as clinically extremely vulnerable, and what that means for the support that they need, but also what that means for the kind of confidence and trust for their families. In terms of this third point here around having really trusting relationships with staff where children have high levels of care needs and support. So there are some conversations and some things to think about today around what that kind of support for those providers might look like. But I think crucially, we're also thinking about how do we make better use of those community partnerships. So where we know we've got universal providers who actually may have a lot of experience around kind of childcare activities, kind of engaging with the kind of food and healthy nutrition aspects of the programme, but perhaps may not have the same experience around working with and supporting children with SEN and disabilities, but also thinking about where those SEND providers and short break providers may not be experienced around that the food and the healthy nutrition aspects, where they've got young people who might have different kind of menu requirements and things like that. Actually, how we manage some of those things through partnership working. So for example, one of the providers I've spoken to this week in Brighton and Hove, an organisation called Extra Time, they've developed a partnership very quickly prior to the Easter break, where they engaged with the local food partnership programme, an organisation and a local caterer who'd been approved to do some of that work. They engaged with the community transport team, and actually between them, even for those children and young people that were shielding because they were clinically extremely vulnerable, managed to deliver activity packs, parts of the programme, and to do things in a slightly more creative way. Okay, next slide please, Chris. So I just wanted to share a little bit of the feedback in terms of the way and kind of the level at which local authorities feel that they have been able to engage with the SEND community around the HAF programme. So there are 3 different examples that I'm going to share here. This first one is from one of our online forums in our national communities of practice, which is for something that we've affectionately termed the DISCO, but stands for the Designated Social Care Officer for SEND, which is a strategic role around SEND and social care. We've got 160 members on the online forum, and when we asked this question about how much they knew about the holiday activities and food programme and how they were engaging with that for children with SEND, only 40% of the areas confirmed that they had a really kind of effectively joined up strategic plan around how to get the programme rolled out to children with SEND. 27% said that some individuals or teams were sort of involved in the conversations, but they weren't clear on what the plans were for how to kind of deliver that. And 13% said that there was very little join up at all. So there was a bit of confusion around whether children with SEND were eligible for the HAF programme, as well as their short break provision, or as well as the other support they might be accessing in the community. Next slide, please, Chris. And then these were just feedback from 2 of our other networks. So the one on the left is thinking about the SEND local offer from 0 to 25 in each area. So every local authority has a local offer which focuses on sharing kind of relevant information about community support and activities and other supports and services for children and young people with SEND and their families. So this community of practice, we've got 114 members, and they are all the kind of leads for the local offer websites and services in their local areas. So 35% of those who responded, and this poll was put out last week, said that there was detailed, accessible information about the HAF programme that was specific to the support that is available for children with SEND. Another 29% had more general information, but nothing that really helped families navigate what it means for their particular set of needs or set of circumstances. And then 36% had said there was limited or no information available on the local offer in relation to the HAF programme. The information on the right here is one of our other forums, which is a short breaks community of practice. So these are short break providers, short break coordinators from local authority teams, and some of those responsible for short breaks in disabled children's teams. So again, we asked the question, how much do you know about the HAF programme, what it means for children and young people with SEND? So we had 44% here that were actively involved, including supporting their short break providers to engage with the HAF grants and what the programme looked like. 12% had heard of HAF, but actually had providers within the HAF programme that were not currently supporting children with SEND, so they hadn't been able to join that up. And 34% of those responding said that they weren't currently involved in the work at all. So I think really one of the crucial messages from today is kind of identify who are your local partners, who are the teams within the local authority that you need on your steering groups, that we need to have engaged in thinking about how to get the messages out there, and making sure that we've got all the key information for families in all of the places, particularly that are specialist information services for children, young people with SEND and their parents and carers. Okay, if you can go to the next slide, please, Chris. So we just wanted to really pick up here on why it's really important in this context to prioritise this group of children and young people. So just a bit of kind of national evidence and kind of feedback. And actually most of this evidence was pre-pandemic, and I suspect that there are some additional challenges now as a result of the last kind of year and a half of experiences that family have had, particularly with we know increased unemployment and some of those issues. But in terms of costs, we know from evidence that it costs up to 3 times as much to raise a disabled child as it does to raise a child without disabilities, and that only 1 in 13 disabled children receive a regular support service of any sort from their local authority. So that, you know, could include short breaks. So we may have quite a significant group of these children and young people who may not already be accessing any community activities over the summer or those support. And part of that is to do with a particular stigma and the kind of proportionate and accessible pathways that may or may not be available in local areas to access that kind of support. So, for example, we know at a national level there's huge variation in the thresholds for access to short breaks. In some areas you can access short breaks via the local offer and via an early help pathway, but actually in other areas there is a requirement to have a formal Section 17 assessment as a child in need. And so actually the variation in engagement with those is quite significant across the country. Next slide, please, Chris. Thank you. And so this is just also to emphasise that actually only 16% of mothers with disabled children work compared to 61% of other mothers, which can lead to kind of a significant reduction in income and an increase in the number of children that might be children with SEND that might be eligible for free school meals and therefore eligible for the HAF programme. But we also know that there are also likely to be an increase in single parent families, because sometimes actually due to some of the crisis situations that can arise and some of the impact on relationships around having a child or young person with significant additional needs can sometimes also be correlated to an increased rate of divorce in families. So there's a huge amount of national kind of research and evidence that emphasises why it's so important that we think about how we engage this group of children and young people with the programme. Okay, next slide please, Chris. So when we're thinking about identifying the children and young people with SEND who might be eligible for the programme, there are a whole range of different practitioners and teams and providers who might already be involved with them. So I guess when we've got, once we're still in kind of school term time, inevitably kind of key places would be engaging with special schools in local areas and also identifying those children and young people that may be placed in education settings away from their homes during the school term times, but maybe at home during the holidays. Looking at then where we've got children and young people with an education, health and care plan who might also be eligible for free school meals, who might be already engaged with short break provision and who might also have a child in need plan. So we know that under the Children Act, all disabled children are identified as children in need and therefore are eligible for an assessment which is likely to be held in disabled children's teams in local authority areas. So once we've got an idea of who these groups of children and young people are, then we need to work out how we can best reach into those communities and engage with those families to let them know about the support that's available. So if you can go to the next slide, please, Chris, we can just talk a bit more about the different routes to share information. So we've talked a little bit about the SEND local offer. So in local areas, every local authority has a duty to have this service for children and young people with SEND and their families. It's a 0 to 25 service that shares all the provision in local areas, including how to access those services, how to apply for support and who is eligible. So developing some kind of specific messages that are related to how the HAF programme is available for children with SEND in your local area and making sure that your local offer rep has that information is really crucial. We've then got SEND Information Advice and Support Service, or SENDIAS services. So these are kind of key links to families in local areas who have a duty again. So every local authority has an impartial SENDIAS service in their local authority area who will be engaging directly with children, young people and families to share information about these services. The National Network of Parent Carer Forums is another organisation who can support with disseminating this. They have a parent carer forum again in every local authority area, and these are parent carers of children and young people with SEND who will likely to be needing to access some of this support. And then obviously we've already talked a bit about kind of linking in with your disabled children's teams, short break teams, and also short break providers. So thinking about, you know, some of the quick wins that we might have around this programme, because some of the outcomes for short break providers are very much aligned, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next part of the session. But actually there may be a number of children and young people who have already been allocated spaces with their short break providers for the summer, that actually we might be able to just identify who of those are eligible for the HAF programme support around food, and then engage with those providers and make those partnerships and those connections ahead of the summer to ensure that as a minimum, all of those children and young people already engaged with a provider are able to access the support that they need through HAF. Okay, so if we can go to the next slide, Chris, and then there's just a short video on this slide that I wanted to share with everyone. And I think it just brings to life a bit the kind of similarities around the way that the short break service offer should run for children and young people with SEND, and what that looks like in the context then of the HAF programme. So if you could just play that, Chris, that'd be brilliant.
This is my short break, everybody.
This is my short break.
It's my choice. My short break. My short break.
I am Childcare for my short break. I'm going bowling. That was fun. Now I need to join. This is my workout Aisha. What do you do in a short break?
Our nails is one of our favourites, coming to the coffee shop for a drink and a chat. We like to talk boys and just chilling out really, don't we?
I love my short break because it gives me independence and it gives me some time for me.
Lucy. Playground.
Four!
Jamming. Sensory. Animals. Music. Toys. To play.
Hi, I'm Mike, and for my short break, I'm going indoor skydiving. Thank you, JD. That was absolutely amazing. Tell me, who could do this?
Absolutely anyone and everyone can do it from the age of 3 up to 103. We cater to every single person, no matter if they have any disabilities or whatnot.
I tell you what, you probably have the coolest job in the world. I love these short breaks because it gains my confidence, it lets me go out of the house, and it lets me have these amazing experiences which I think I would never do before.
else is chosen for her short break to come to activity centre?
I've done it! We were going to go on a boat on the river.
How's your day today?
We went on the boat.
What else did we do this
We
morning?
did some climbing.
So it's been a good day?
Yeah.
High five.
It's exciting.
Adventure. It's awesome.
It's independent.
It's mine.
It's freedom.
It's fun.
Thanks, Chris. So it'd be great to hear any kind of thoughts or reflections from people in the chat as we go through on what they thought about the video. But I guess the real kind of point to emphasize about that for me is that actually you can see from all of those types of activities that they're really aligned with the kind of things that we're seeing happening in the HAF programme for other children and young people. And actually we can make those inclusive, and we can make sure that disabled children and young people have the same opportunity to participate in those things as others. And actually for many of them, they might already be doing that. So this is just the kind of legal emphasis around short breaks in local authority areas that I just wanted to highlight as well. So there is a specific duty which states that in relation to disabled children, every local authority shall provide services which are designed to minimise the effect on disabled children within their area of their disabilities. So essentially in practice to give them that equity of opportunity with other children and young people, to give them the opportunity to lead lives which are as normal as possible, and to assist those who provide care for those children to continue to do so, or to do so more effectively by giving them breaks from caring. And for me, that's quite an important one in the context of this as well, because we also know from that slide earlier on that actually only 1 in 13 families were accessing the support and services that they could in a local area. So there's still a huge number of families that aren't aware that they're entitled to short breaks opportunities for their disabled child. And if actually those are children and young people who are also eligible for the HAF programme, this is a real opportunity to engage them with some of those providers, and to then, you know, there's a lot of evidence that short breaks are a really supportive, preventative intervention that will enable families to continue in their caring role and potentially prevent them from deteriorating into crisis over time, and then ending up entering the kind of statutory social care system. So it's really good to think about this as an opportunity also to engage more families with short breaks. Now, that's not to say that that doesn't inevitably throw up its own challenges, and I'm sure there'll be people on the kind of session thinking, what about capacity, what about demand for those services, and waiting lists and things like that. So I think there are a number of things that have come out of a couple of areas that we've been in touch with over this. If you could just go on to the next slide for me, Chris. So these are kind of a few of the different types of provision that disabled children and those with special educational needs might be accessing. So we've got short breaks up there that we talked about. We've also got other universal services through the Send Local offer that might be a kind of targeted support service, but that you can access without an assessment in the same way. And then on the left here, we've got direct payments. Now, direct payments are a way that potentially some of those young people in the video might have been paying for their personal assistant who's taking them out into the community. So I wonder if we can even start doing some really creative thinking about actually, if a young person is eligible for the HAF programme, but they currently have a short break delivered through a direct payment to a personal assistant, is there something we can do to make sure that as part of that short break, they get a hot meal? Is there something we can do to make sure that that's factored into the planning of those sessions, and that conversations are happening with those support workers to enable those things to happen effectively? Can we actually provide them with some training, those direct payment workers, around what healthy, nutritious food is, and how they can pass on those messages to the families that they're working with, and that sort of thing. And then also thinking about in terms of the kind of capacity issue with short break providers, one example that was given in Brighton and Hove was where the local authority actually hired a primary school out for the summer as a venue. Although the children that were coming there were potentially the same groups of children every day, they invited different providers in every day to provide different types of activities. So actually then you haven't only got one provider trying to meet the needs of this entire additional group of children and young people, but also actually from the perspective of what I was talking about a minute ago in terms of raising awareness of short breaks and engaging those children, it means that some of those children get to have kind of a taster of a short break session, and their families get to build some of those trusting relationships with those providers and those staff as part of that process. Okay, if you could go to the next slide, please, Chris. Thank you. So I also just wanted to share, because as I touched on earlier, we also will have a number of children and young people in this group who might have been shielding from time to time over the last year because they've been kind of told by their consultants or their GPs that they are in a kind of clinically vulnerable or clinically extremely vulnerable category. And this inevitably has led to a real need for some creative practice to happen in order to support families to still continue to have some sort of break, and for children and young people to still have a really positive experience even when they are not always able to attend settings in person, or in fact where they are, but where that kind of needs to be delivered in a different kind of perhaps slightly more pragmatic and creative kind of way. So as part of some work we did on this in the first lockdown, we just put out a really short call for examples from providers who had been able to continue working with families during even that very first period of change that we had. And I guess there are a few key themes that I think are relevant across all of the things that we're thinking about when we're working with disabled children. So ongoing communication with families was really crucial as part of this issue of understanding changing needs for support. Actually, disabled children and young people's needs might fluctuate. You might have some children and young people who at the beginning of the summer break, for example, their families are coping really well and they've managed to have plans in place. But actually, as that period of time of children being at home longer term continues, actually people become more stressed and more tired, and the level of care that they're providing is kind of increasing and continued for those longer periods of time. So how can we think about managing that with families and just stay in touch with them to understand where those needs might be shifting? Creative use of technology, I think, has just been a theme running throughout everyone's life for the last year. But actually, for disabled children and young people, it's tended to go one of two ways. For some young people, it's worked really effectively. It means they've been able to engage much better and in a completely different way, but actually for others it doesn't work as well. So it's really important that we aren't just viewing it as a blanket kind of replacement to the other opportunities that are out there. And then thinking about how we kind of redesign provision of support and have kind of really responsive decision making. And I think that's probably a really crucial one over the next couple of weeks while we're thinking about how we engage families with disabled children into this programme of work, because inevitably some of the timelines are going to be much shorter now. However, despite that, we know that we've also got the opportunity to make plans for the Christmas break beyond the summer as well. So I think getting some of those kind of processes and decision making things in place now is a really good idea. Next slide, please. So what I wanted to do here was just signpost people to some of the more detailed learning examples about the specific ways that providers had adapted their approach to, for example, risk assessment and using that as part of their planning, thinking about how they engaged with some of the kind of government guidance around bringing children and young people who were categorised as clinically extremely vulnerable together, but actually making sure that they were able to reassure those parents, keep those children and young people safe. And for many of the services, they managed to continue delivering face-to-face without any positive COVID tests or cases happening throughout the summer and the Christmas period last year as well. Okay, next slide, please. And this is just in a bit more detail in terms of the things that supported some of those providers to work well. And I guess what would be really helpful for this programme is to really capitalise on some of the very strong partnerships that were built in the SEND kind of sector throughout the last year. So actually very quickly, local authorities, providers in local areas, school communities came together and across CCGs to very quickly identify the most vulnerable children, young people and families. And actually those children, young people and families are absolutely the ones that we're most likely to want to be thinking about engaging with this programme. making decisions, as I've said, and where appropriate, delegating that responsibility. So I think if we can start to think flexibly about, you know, how we tie together the provision that's being made through short breaks and the provision that might be a young person might be eligible for through HAF. Actually, if we can bring that together and identify where we've already got a young person who is having maybe 2 days a week of a summer play scheme or something of that nature, and explore actually, is there a top-up support? You know, could that play scheme provide an additional day and provide food on the 2 days that they're already going in order to meet the kind of the different level of eligibility if they're eligible for both? How do we kind of blend those things together? And in fact, if there was another provider who was able to provide a 3rd day, could we think about buddying up a SEND specialist provider with perhaps a universal provider actually, and have some skills sharing happening, so that actually we have a kind of longer term sustainability and a market development opportunity out of all of this work as well. Okay, next slide please, Chris. And so another thing around this was, of course, about being flexible in supporting families, and I think that's also crucial here. So we talked a little bit about the challenges for some children and families with SEND around the kind of 4-4-4 approach. We know that some providers will be providing a 6-hour day. We know that some families will feed back that actually in 4 hours there's very little they can achieve in terms of a break at that time. So there's something here about how do we think flexibly about delivering some of those things, and also really acknowledging that actually we can't always go from A to Z. We can't always go from nothing to having like the perfect, you know, guidance, explicit delivery of exactly what we were hoping to do. But actually what we can do is start to take some of those steps towards it. So, you know, what we would hope, as I said earlier, is you know, as a minimum, that any children and young people already allocated places for the summer in short breaks who may not previously have been providing a meal can now be identified if they're eligible for that, and those short break providers can be supported to enable that to happen for at least that group of young people for the summer break. Okay, next slide please. So this was just to emphasise really that often, particularly where there can be challenges around demand and capacity, and some of those anxieties, particularly for some providers around supporting disabled children and young people, a key message from many of the providers that managed to maintain their services operating for families during the kind of lockdowns was that risk assessment is very much about an enabler to providing service the right way. So one of the quotes from them was that risk assessment, which supports effective risk management rather than creating a barrier, led to creative thinking, different approaches to face-to-face support rather than support being withdrawn, especially for those children, young people and families who are particularly vulnerable or at high risk of going into crisis during the pandemic. But actually we also know that any time where school isn't available, so during summer holidays, during Easter holidays, during breaks, are also for this particular group of children and their families quite a high risk time for crisis. Okay, next slide please. And so then in the context of this, I just wanted to raise a few points around the Equalities Act and some of the reasonable adjustments that we might be then needing to make in order to ensure that the services that are providing the HAF programme are as inclusive as possible for disabled children and young people. So just a little bit of background on the Equalities Act 2010, which brought all the pre-existing equality duties together in a single legal framework. So it extended then the duties to include protection from discrimination for pupils who are pregnant or have recently given birth, pupils who are undergoing gender reassignment. So it really extended the kind of legal framework around equality. It replaced 9 different acts of parliament and almost 100 different sets of regulations to bring all of this stuff into one place. But actually, most notably, disability is treated differently than other groups in important respects. So for most groups, equality is rooted in equal treatment, but actually for disabled people and for disabled kind of pupils and students in schools and then other community settings as well, it often means that we need to treat them more favourably. And I think this is best demonstrated by the kind of image on the next slide. So if Chris, you can move over to that. So this slide just kind of demonstrates on the left here that if we give everyone the same thing, it doesn't necessarily need the same experience. And what we want to achieve is the same experience for everyone, which is that version on the right, which doesn't mean everyone being treated exactly the same. It actually means that we kind of adapt to the individual situation of that person's needs. Okay, next slide, please, Chris. So I just wanted to come on to talk a little bit about some of the specific nuances of safeguarding for disabled children and young people, and just to flag that what we know about kind of abuse and neglect and some of the vulnerabilities and risk for this group is that there are significantly kind of increased likelihood of those things happening. So we've got that disabled children and young people are 3.4 times more likely to be abused and neglected, 3.8 times more likely to be neglected specifically in its own right, 3.1 times more likely to be sexually abused, 3.9 times more likely to be emotionally abused, and 3.8 times more likely to be physically abused. And actually there are a few kind of examples and indicators of harm that I wanted to just talk through with people, just so that we've got an idea in our minds, because I think sometimes, particularly when there are long-term relationships with families, particularly because as a society, sometimes we tend to underestimate the idea that actually disabled children are at this increased risk, or in fact are at risk at all, particularly for things like sexual abuse and physical abuse. We tend to kind of, or certainly research tells us that there is a tendency to kind of normalise those things or blame those things on a disability rather than on the context that they might be. So you can go on to the next slide for me, Chris. I just wanted to kind of think a little bit about these areas in more detail. So, you know, a couple of kind of possible indicators of harm for disabled children could be a bruise in a site that, you know, for example, might not be of concern on a child that is mobile, but actually might be of concern on a non-mobile child. So, for example, a bruise on the shin. You know, if you're a young child who's running around constantly and falling over in the playground, that may not be a particular concern. But if you're a child or young person who's a wheelchair user, that might mean something different. Not getting enough help with feeding, so which could lead to malnourishment. Poor toileting arrangements, so thinking about what those things mean for and being able to kind of identify them. Lack of stimulation, unjustified or excessive use of restraint, and then actually some more kind of I would say what might seem less significant things. So actually people making a significant effort to kind of use and understand a child or young person's communication needs. One kind of quite key indicator is, for example, if disabled children and young people are arriving at settings without the right communication aids or being denied the right equipment to support them to engage properly. So, you know, a couple of examples of things that have kind of been perceived as, you know, sometimes even behaviours that can be perceived like they might be almost a safeguard in their own right, but actually could also be an indicator of abuse. So one example is a concern that was raised around possible sexual abuse of a 6-year-old girl with learning disabilities, and when it was raised with the residential staff at the school setting she went to, they had suggested that they didn't think she could be abused because of how violently she resisted nappy changing. But actually, at the same time, that violent resistance to nappy changing could also be an indicator that she'd had a really negative experience about something. So it's just thinking, it's just being aware and open to the idea that actually disabled children and young people are just as likely, and in fact, if not more likely, to perhaps be experiencing some of these things. However, I would also stress that, of course, this is not all disabled children and young people, and actually, you know, in the same way that we would be following our normal child protection processes, it's just to make sure that we have that same attention to detail and that same focus and that same kind of desire to get to know families and understand the needs and the communication needs of children and young people, and to kind of share and escalate things as necessary. Okay, next slide, please. So, sort of just in conclusion, before we start to move into the kind of Q&A section of the session, I just wanted to flag a couple of kind of specific things that we've sort of touched on already, but really just to be thinking about quick wins within this. Try not to get too bogged down in the guidance. Actually, what we know for in order to meet the individual needs of children and families with disabilities, and what most of the short break providers who are involved in the programme have come back and said is that being able to depart from the guidance with good reason has been really crucial, particularly in getting things up and running quickly for the summer. So making sure that you've got the right advice into your team, so thinking about who is involved in the HAF steering group at local level. Have we got a range of local partners that include those with expertise in SEND and include those kind of partnerships? Have we got opportunities to engage with training? So much of the training around SEND and inclusive practice will exist in local authorities. It will exist in kind of disabled children's teams, potentially with the kind of multi-agency safeguarding partnerships and arrangements in relation to safeguarding disabled children. What are the opportunities for upskilling providers who might already be engaged in the programme but may not currently be providing to children with SEND? And similarly, what are those opportunities to identify those providers who are currently working with children with SEND and to then bring them kind of into the fold of kind of working in partnership with those other providers around the food and the catering and that support. I think one of the other things that was raised to me by some of our providers was around the kind of the trade-off between hot food and cold food. So a lot of our short break providers might have been encouraging children and young people to bring a packed lunch, in which case they're unlikely to have hot food. They're likely to bring cold food with them, and therefore after doing some work with the families that were attending and with some of the children and young people, they actually made the decision that the meal that they provide is a very healthy, nutritious cold meal, so that actually there is no stigma for those children and young people who are receiving the free meal as part of the programme versus the meal that they've brought with them. So that's just one example of kind of thinking about how we're flexible, how we create those opportunities as an interim step while we get to the place where we've got that broader plan. Okay, so I think that's probably enough of me talking for now, and it would be really, really good to start to hear from some of the people, and I hope that people have been kind of noting in the chat, and I'm sure Ben will kind of bring that in as we move into the next part of the session. So the next slide is just to introduce the questions, but I'm also happy for us potentially to come back onto the screen as a group if people want to have a kind of more informal conversation.
Thanks, Caroline. There's a few comments in the chat. So some of them might be a bit more specific to kind of program guidance, but I can kind of read them out, Caroline, and if you've got anything to comment, otherwise we can take it away and respond offline. So a comment from Trevor around the eligibility for HAF for SEND children who are on EHC and short breaks.
So I think in terms of that, so inevitably there's a crossover between children who have SEND and might have an education, health and care plans, who might have be accessing short breaks and who are also eligible for free school meals. So that's the first cohort. But also within the guidance, there was an additional opportunity to use part of the grant for children and young people in some of those extra vulnerable groups. So it's just about kind of thinking through mapping your own local area population and then thinking how that fits with the programme.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi, this is Trevor from Sutton. I'm the one who put the question in. Part of my question also was, because short breaks are running provisions in the summer, and we're running provisions in the summer, I mean, I had a discussion with a short break colleague and they were a bit concerned that we had a lot more provision or a lot more funds than what they had. But one of the stumbling block was identifying if SEN who are on short breaks were eligible for HAF. So how would I know if they're eligible for HAF?
So I guess essentially in the same way that that we would establish if any other children or young people are eligible for free school meals. So already having access to a service as a result of kind of an assessment through the disabled children's team or accessing short breaks should not in any way preclude a child or young person who is eligible for free school meals having access to the HAF programme. I think what areas have tried to do in terms of being creative and bringing those two things together is some areas we've got some of the HAF budget being shared into the short breaks teams for the summer support to kind of reinforce the kind of healthy nutrition and food aspect of that programme, because as we've kind of highlighted in this, actually the kind of outcomes are really aligned across short breaks and the HAF programme in terms of activities and enriching things to do and being active and all of those things. But actually, perhaps the bit that might not have always been as kind of evident as part of that programme of work is the kind of access to education about food and healthy, nutritious planning and that provision of a meal.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think you've answered the question. I mean, my main thing was that a lot of there is some SEN that are not eligible for free school meals, but they are eligible for short breaks. So we tend to be getting a lot of them coming to us and saying that they're eligible. So what you're saying is that if they're not entitled to free school meals, they will not be eligible for the HAF programme.
So I guess the guidance says two things. It says, depending on the local authority area and the way that you have applied for the grant and chosen to allocate the grant, there is potential for a proportion of it to be around wider vulnerable children's groups and not only those eligible for free school meals, although that is the primary group. Beyond that, there is also the opportunity for HAF providers to charge additional and allow, so not necessarily to give a free place that's funded through the programme, but to allow other children and young people to attend a programme of activities in order to do that. I can see that Kira's got her hand up, so I'm wondering if she might have, from a local authority perspective, might be able to answer this better than I obviously am.
Thank you very much for your answer anyway.
I'm talking from Portsmouth, and we had approval from the Department for Education team to have 15% of our expenditure to spend on those deemed vulnerable, of which some of the cases you've discussed, Trevor, may come under that. However, it is important that it's something that's been approved. So it was our South coordinator that sent us that notification. It was based on what we put into our Easter report, because we said we did have those that we would like to access the programme who maybe weren't able to, or that we did cater for because we deemed them vulnerable. So now they've given us that 15% allowance. So I think it'd be a case of checking whether you have that, Trevor, and then using it accordingly.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yes, we do have that as well. We did get approval to use 15%, which we said we was going to use for COVID affected children as well as short break. So, but yeah, thank you for that. But just wanting to clarify. So, thank you.
Thanks, Trevor and Kira. There was a question around the food element and that many cannot access a universal food offer, and I know Kira's given quite a lengthy response, which I won't read out. But Kira, do you want to just come back in and touch upon that?
Yeah, of course. It just made me think of something Enableability fed back, which, and it doesn't necessarily exclusive to Enableability and the SEND children they support, but it was a case of rebranding what they were offering. So it was presented as yogurt and fruit one day, of which all the children said, oh no, don't like the look of that. They then a couple of days later presented it again, but frozen, and said it was ice cream, and they 100% approval rate. And I think that would go for any children or young people that maybe don't respond to something that's new to them. But Enableability are working really hard on how they can sort of reinvent their menu choices. And a key part of that is the fact that they're having the discussions with the families, because obviously it's not just about the child that's in attendance, it's also about what they have access to at home. And we found with all our providers, because of the nutritional element of HAF, they're all having to reconsider how they approach it. So it's having a positive effect, but of course these things take time to change habits and what have you. And it was with the negative comments they got back from the SEND children were either based on the behaviours of other children, so maybe they weren't comfortable with particular children at the camp, and food. And that's sort of, I think, going to be fairly universal response, and it's just a case of being inventive with how you present it and making sure the families are involved, and they're hoping to do more hands-on experiences with that in the summer if sort of restrictions allow, which obviously it didn't at Easter.
Thanks, Kira. I've noticed Wendy's got her hand up. Do you want to add something, Wendy?
Yeah, so hi, sorry, I'm Wendy Gray from Gloucestershire County Council. I put that in the chat. I think it was more thinking about, we had a meeting yesterday with our Parent Carer Forum, and we were challenged very heavily, I have to say, on how we would differentiate for children with additional needs in terms of dietary requirements, or children who, for, you know, particularly mum was talking about her child who's a high functioning autistic child who would not eat anything in front of anybody else. We had families there whose children had food intolerances, or actually were peg fed, or had, you know, huge dietary requirements. And actually, as part of the activities, we're not worried about how we're inclusive with the activities, but we have got some concerns about how we address all the dietary requirements within a group.
So I think from my perspective, Wendy, I think that's a really good point, and I think there will be some specific circumstances where that's challenging. I guess one of the reasons why connecting up then with local short break and send specialist providers to deliver part of the HAF programme for this group of children and young people is really important, because actually they will already have staff who are used to working in those kind of environments. So, you know, I can't think, in the local authorities that I've worked in, I can't think of a single short break provider who works with autistic children who wouldn't have come across a circumstance where they have an autistic child who isn't comfortable eating in front of other children and young people, or who isn't comfortable eating certain textures and things like that. So I think part of that is about having a variety of different food types that children and young people can at least have some level of choice, whether that's even an advanced choice when they've been booked into a course. But I think also having a particular, so for a child or young person with autism of that nature, I would expect most of those SEND providers to be able to allocate for a 15-minute period of something while they were eating lunch, to have a one-to-one supporter who could take them into a safe space where they were able to eat their meal confidently and comfortably, and then rejoin the activities afterwards.
Thank you. Yeah, I suppose it's just about thinking about, you know, because when you, it's difficult when you talk about food, because there's so many dietary requirements and restricted diets, that I think if we're trying to be inclusive, and we want many of our children who have sent to attend universal groups rather than have their own groups, it's how we address that within those universal groups that I think is a bit more challenging.
One of the ways that I've seen that work is by, so I guess essentially potentially thinking about whether there are, so even if it's not in the short break settings, one opportunity might be to explore whether there are teaching assistants or anyone like that who work in the special schools in local areas who might be interested in summer opportunities. So what we've seen work in the past is that they would then kind of essentially be supporting groups of children and young people with SEND to access universal settings. So they would go to the universal provision still, but be supported by someone with a more SEND specialist background. And that might not last a long time. It might just be as part of an introduction and to upskill staff in that universal provider to be able to deliver some of those things, or even to buddy up with other young people in the universal provider to support some of that to happen between a non-disabled and a disabled young person, and to create some of those relationships.
Thank you. Yeah, I've got nothing else, thanks.
And there was also a comment in the chat from Samantha just saying that the registration form would need to capture the additional needs so that those preparations could be made, and then the coordinator would discuss those specific requirements with the child, young person and their family, as well as links to the DCT team for further advice. Thanks for that, Sam. Are there any further questions at this point? I wonder if I could maybe bring in Kira again, because I know you kindly agreed just to say a few words on Portsmouth's SEND offer. We're putting in a lot of great work, although I know you're keen to stress it is still a work in progress. Would you be okay to share a few words, Kira?
Yeah, absolutely. And I did want to highlight work in progress, because we can't ever fix anything overnight. And we started this at Easter. I think we were lucky we had enableability on board at Easter, so we knew we had SEND specific that we could direct those children and young people too. And because it was such a success, we've managed to fund an additional play scheme. So we've now got the sort of city centre and the north of the city covered by that, and they're doing the full 5 weeks. With engaging enableability, you then get the full package because they're already set up for being able to do individual house visits, really understanding the children before they attend and getting information like Wendy's saying about their dietary requirements, what works and what doesn't and everything. That's quite a lot of additional work for your universal providers to do. However, we've really stressed through the registration process that they get as much information as possible in advance from any family. With our YMCA day camp, they actually have enableability workers linked in already, so they have some in attendance, but they did find at Easter that what some of the parents or even the schools were doing, because they were afraid that SEND children would get turned away, they weren't necessarily declaring their needs in advance. So it meant that they had to be fairly adaptable on the day, and once they got to learn the child, that actually there was more going on than was declared, and it did actually stretch their staffing and child ratio. So we've linked in with local offer, so our SEND here at in Portsmouth, and they've actually done a dedicated web page for us now, which I'll share the link. So what that means is we're now definitely getting the information to the correct families, but also linking in with them on terms of what language to use. So they've used what we do, but hoping that with the search engine now in Google, it'll be the type of things that their family would be looking for, and therefore they'll find it. We're also sending links to some training modules for SEND. So through our Learning Gateway at Portsmouth, we're able to give them temporary access to some of our training as well. And that's something that our providers identified at Easter that they'd like to know more about as well. So that's why the HAF is a fantastic opportunity for that, for adding value to the training and knowledge of the providers. With our application form this time, we also asked in advance whether providers were comfortable and suitably prepped for supporting SEND children. So again, now on that local offer page, we've been able to highlight exactly which providers they can have that conversation with, stressing that it's done on a case-by-case basis, because it's important that we know that the providers will have the necessary staff. And we've also got a disability champion now on our steering group, which was really helpful because it was just someone there literally being a champion for those children and families. And, you know, as Wendy was saying, she got a bit of a grilling the other day. We did as well. When we presented what the programme would be, it was like, OK, but where does SEND fit into that? And let's not just give them the enableability as an option. And we've also doing a professional referral process now. So linking back to what Trevor said about the 15% expenditure we have for those that are vulnerable, we're allocating that, and it has to be a direct referral from the local services. So it might be family hubs, young carers, asylum seekers from our play or youth services, children's and social services, and our schools, so that we can have sight of who we're referring and making sure that we're targeting those most in need. And if they do have an additional need, it's also, again, that opportunity to learn more, so you don't just assume, oh, there'll be a match with enableability, learning more about them so that we can see what other provision would be suitable. And we've asked for them to report on it with their data that they give us after their registers and in the evaluation process, because at Easter we didn't actually know exactly how many SEND children or young people we catered for. So we're hoping to have a better idea now after the summer, having given them a heads up that that's the number we'll require.
Thanks, Kira. Really appreciate the insight there. Would anyone like to pose any questions on what they've just heard Kira say there, or any questions more generally?
I'd also note that we did find, for instance, we wanted to engage with Portsmouth Penguins, who were swimming SEND and disability specific group, but they've had to stop during COVID. So I think obviously SEND or disability groups tend to be more at risk with COVID and things. So I don't think they're up to full availability at all, and that's going to take some time. But if anything did come up during our summer weeks, we're still keen to hear from people and sign it off if we can, because we're finding that some are just a bit later to the game and getting back up and running again.
I was just going to add to that, Ben, if that's okay. One of the other things that it might be worth thinking about, and I know I've talked a bit about kind of other short break providers supporting to upskill staff in universal providers, but actually what we hear so often is that parent carers would be really happy to provide some of that support to providers themselves. So if they've filled in an application, if having a conversation with them about the needs of their child isn't sufficient, actually speaking to them and saying, would you come in and meet for an hour with the individual that's going to be supporting your child at a universal provision, or to bring your child in for kind of a visit session first to kind of work out things, might also be a really good opportunity for thinking about how we make some of those settings more inclusive.
Thanks, Caroline and Kira. Any final questions, or we'll just wrap up there? Appreciate a little bit early, but please do take the opportunity now if you have anything else to ask Caroline or more generally. Okay, so if there's no further comments, we'll wrap up there. Many thanks to Caroline for today's presentation and insight, and thank you to everyone on the call for your time. I hope it's been useful. I've put links into the chat to sign up to the 2 next upcoming Bitesize sessions. There's one this Friday at 10 AM on meeting the school food standards, which will be delivered by Food for Life. And there's another next Tuesday, the 13th at 2 o'clock, which is around signposting families to wider services and support. And we've also put a link to an evaluation form for this session. So it'd be grateful if you could just take a few minutes to fill that out. We're also looking forward to welcoming you for another round of cluster meetings starting next week. So please do get in contact with the HAF help desk if you haven't received an invite for those. Otherwise, thank you, everyone. Good luck to those watching the England football team. Even as a Scottish fan, I can say we're looking forward to that match. Otherwise, all the best. Good luck for the last few weeks preparation. There's some fantastic work going on, so keep going. And I know we're all really looking forward to seeing children enjoying HAF this summer. So thanks for your time and have a nice afternoon.